In the autumn of 1887, beneath a sky stretched thin and pale over the cotton fields of rural Alabama, there stood a schoolhouse that had weathered more seasons than most of its students would ever see. It was a simple structure built from pine and good intention, its boards bleached silver by the sun and warped gently by decades of rain. The building leaned slightly to the east, as though listening for something just beyond the tree line, and inside its single room, 23 children sat in rows that Thursday morning, their hands folded on desks carved with the initials of students long since grown or gone. The air smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke, of damp wool and the faint sweetness of the last wildflowers clinging to life outside the windows. Miss Adelaide Porter, the schoolteacher, moved between the rows with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 8 years learning how to command attention without raising her voice, her gray skirts whispering against the floorboards. She straightened a collar here, smoothed a cowlick there, her fingers gentle but efficient. The children fidgeted as children do, their bodies humming with the restless energy of youth, their eyes darting toward the windows where sunlight spilled through the shutters in brilliant, dusty shafts. At the front of the room stood the photographer, a traveling man named Silas Webb, who had arrived that morning with his equipment packed carefully in a wagon drawn by a tired mule. His camera was a magnificent contraption, all polished wood and brass fittings, mounted on a tripod that seemed too delicate for the weight it bore. He had positioned it with mathematical precision, measuring distances with a length of string, tilting the lens just so to capture the maximum amount of natural light. This was not an unusual scene. Across the American South, such photographs were being taken in schoolhouses and churches, on front porches and town squares, freezing moments that would otherwise dissolve into the fog of forgetting. But there was something about this particular gathering, something in the quality of the silence that descended when Miss Porter finally called for stillness, that felt different. Perhaps it was the way one girl in the third row sat without moving, her hands placed too precisely in her lap, her expression smoothed of all the tiny movements that mark a living face. Perhaps it was the shadow that fell across her features cast by nothing visible in the room, or the way the other children seemed to lean subtly away from her without realizing they were doing so. The photographer counted down from 3, his voice muffled by the black cloth draped over his head and shoulders. The shutter clicked with a sound like a bolt sliding home. The image was captured, fixed in silver salts and chemicals, preserved for a future that none of them could imagine. And in that frozen moment, sealed away in darkness until the plate could be developed, lay a detail that would haunt historians for generations. No one in that quiet Alabama schoolhouse could have guessed that this single photograph would outlive them all, or that within its frozen smiles lay a truth too chilling to ignore. The Whitfield family lived 3 miles from the schoolhouse, down a rutted road that turned to red mud when it rained and dust when it did not. Their farm was small, carved from land that had never been particularly generous, and the house that stood at its center was a testament to stubborn endurance rather than prosperity. It had been built by Clara's grandfather, a man she had never known, who had come to Alabama with nothing but a wagon and a belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. That belief had been tested, season after season, by droughts and floods, by cotton prices that fell like stones, and debts that climbed like vines, but the Whitfields remained. Clara Whitfield was 12 years old in the autumn of 1887, the eldest of 4 children and the one upon whom so many hopes and responsibilities had settled. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes and a way of moving through the world that suggested she was always thinking 3 steps ahead, planning, calculating, making sure the smaller ones were fed and dressed and safe. In the mornings before the sun had fully risen, she would wake to help her mother with the washing, her hands turning red in the cold water drawn from the well. She would dress her youngest brother Henry, who was only 4 and still clumsy with buttons, and walk with all 3 of her siblings down the long road to school, carrying the lunch pail and making sure no one strayed into the cotton fields where snakes sometimes sunned themselves on the furrows. At school, she was a diligent student, her slate always filled with neat rows of letters and numbers, her recitations careful and clear. Miss Porter often called on her when she needed someone to demonstrate a particularly difficult problem, and Clara would stand at the front of the room, chalk in hand, working through the mathematics with a focus that seemed beyond her years. The other children liked her well enough, though they sometimes found her too serious, too concerned with doing things properly. During recess, while the boys played at war and the younger girls made chains from clover, Clara often sat beneath the oak tree reading, or helping Miss Porter clean the erasers, releasing clouds of white dust into the afternoon light. Her best friend, if she could be said to have one, was Sarah Brennan, a freckled girl with a laugh like birdsong, who lived on the neighboring farm and who could always coax Clara into playing when the work was done. They would run through the fields at sunset, their dresses flying, their voices rising into the gathering dark, and in those moments Clara seemed to shed some of the weight she carried, becoming simply a child again, unburdened and free. But there were signs, if one knew how to read them, that something was not quite right. Clara's laughter, when it came, sometimes ended in a cough that she tried to muffle with her hand. She grew tired more easily than she once had, needing to sit down during the walk home, claiming she had a stone in her shoe when really her legs simply would not carry her any farther. Her mother noticed the pallor in her cheeks, the way her appetite had diminished, but attributed it to the changing season, to growing pains, to the 100 small ailments that children seem to collect and shed like autumn leaves. Miss Porter noticed, too, the way Clara's hand trembled sometimes when she wrote, the distant look that would come into her eyes as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. But the schoolteacher said nothing, not wanting to worry the child or alarm her parents over what might be nothing at all. In hindsight, the small interruptions in Clara's laughter were not just the pauses of a shy child. They were the first cracks in a story about to break. It began on a Tuesday in late September, when the heat of summer still clung to the afternoons, but the mornings had turned cool and crisp. Clara woke with a headache that sat behind her eyes like a weight, and a fever that made her skin feel tight and strange. Her mother, Martha Whitfield, felt her forehead and frowned, but sent her to school anyway, thinking it would pass, thinking that children were always coming down with something and then recovering just as quickly. But by midday, Clara could no longer concentrate on her lessons. The words in her primer swam and blurred, and when Miss Porter asked her to read aloud, she stumbled over sentences she had known by heart the day before. The teacher sent her home early, and Clara walked the 3 miles alone, each step feeling heavier than the last, the sun beating down on her uncovered head like a judgment. By evening, the fever had climbed higher. Martha put her to bed in the room she shared with her sister, laying cold cloths on her forehead and dosing her with the remedies she knew, chamomile tea and willow bark, honey stirred into warm milk. Clara's father, Thomas, stood in the doorway, his face drawn with worry, his hands hanging useless at his sides. They had lost a child before, years ago, a son who had died in infancy, and the memory of that grief sat between them like a ghost. As the days passed, Clara's condition worsened. The fever would not break. She began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that shook her thin frame and left her gasping. Her skin took on a grayish pallor, and her eyes, when they were open, seemed to look at things no one else could see. The neighbors began to visit, bringing their own remedies, mustard plasters and poultices, made from herbs gathered at the dark of the moon, whispered prayers and charms that had been passed down through generations. Mrs. Brennan, Sarah's mother, sat by Clara's bedside and read to her from the Bible, her voice low and steady, while Martha wrung out cloth after cloth in the basin of cool water. On the 5th day, Thomas rode into town to fetch the doctor, a man named Ephraim Cole, who had practiced medicine in 3 counties and who had seen more death than he cared to remember. Dr. Cole examined Clara with grave efficiency, listening to her lungs, checking her pulse, looking into her eyes with a small light. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and instructed the family to keep her comfortable, to give her broth if she would take it, to prepare themselves for the possibility that she might not recover. The word he did not say hung in the air like smoke. The illness had a name, several names: diphtheria or typhoid or any of the other fevers that swept through rural communities like wildfire, taking the young and the weak with impartial cruelty. On the 7th night, as the first frost of the season settled silver on the fields, Clara Whitfield stopped breathing. Her mother, who had not left her side for hours, felt the small hand in hers grow still, felt the faint pulse beneath her fingers flutter and cease. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence that seemed to fill the house and spill out into the night, a silence that would echo in Martha Whitfield's heart for the rest of her life. The schoolroom seat she once filled sat empty, her slate still etched with the unfinished curve of a word. In the days that followed Clara's death, the Whitfield household moved through the rituals of mourning with the numb efficiency of people who had no choice but to continue. The body was washed and dressed by Martha and her sister, who had come from 2 counties over to help with the preparations. They chose Clara's best dress, a simple gray frock with a white collar that she had worn to church on Sundays, and they brushed her dark hair until it shone, braiding it carefully and pinning it with a ribbon that had been a gift on her last birthday. Her hands were folded across her chest, and her eyes were closed, the lids smoothed down with a touch that was both gentle and final. The carpenter in town made a coffin from pine, lining it with cloth that Mrs. Brennan had donated, and Thomas Whitfield carried his daughter's body to the small parlor where she was laid out for viewing. Neighbors came in a steady stream, bringing food and condolences, standing awkwardly in the doorway before approaching the coffin to pay their respects. Some wept openly, others stood in stiff silence, and the children who had been Clara's classmates stared with wide, frightened eyes, confronting perhaps for the first time the reality that they too were mortal, that death could reach into their world and take one of their own. Miss Porter came in the evening, her face drawn and pale, and she stood by the coffin for a long time, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or simply a conversation with a student she would never teach again. It was she who suggested the photograph. The idea came from a tradition that had grown increasingly common in the years following the war between the states, when so many families had lost fathers and sons and brothers, with nothing to remember them by except memory, which faded and distorted with time. Post-mortem photography had become a way to preserve the image of the deceased, to create a lasting record of their presence in the world. But Miss Porter's suggestion was slightly different. She proposed that the entire class be photographed together, as they had planned to do before Clara's illness, and that Clara be included in the portrait. It would be, she explained, a way to honor her memory, to show that she remained a part of their community, even in death, and to give the Whitfield family an image of their daughter as she had been, surrounded by her peers, forever young and forever present. Martha Whitfield agreed, though whether from genuine belief in the idea's merit or simply from the exhausted inability to refuse, no one could say. And so, 3 days after her death, on a morning when the sky was the color of pewter and a cold wind rattled the shutters, Clara Whitfield was brought to the schoolhouse one final time. The photographer, Silas Webb, had been summoned back from the next county, and he set up his equipment with the same careful attention he had shown before. The children were arranged in their usual places, the taller ones standing in the back, the smaller ones seated in front. And in the third row, in the seat she had occupied for 2 years, Clara was positioned with her siblings on either side to help support her, her body dressed and prepared so that she might appear, to the casual observer, to be simply another student, quiet and composed. The teacher had insisted and the parents had allowed it, and Silas Webb, who had photographed the dead before and would photograph them again, saw nothing unusual in the request. The schoolroom was cold that morning, colder than it should have been, and the children shivered in their thin jackets and worn dresses. Someone had lit the stove, but its heat seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled over the room. The living children fidgeted and whispered until Miss Porter's sharp glance silenced them, and then they sat as still as they could manage, their eyes fixed on the camera, or on their laps, or on the windows where gray light seeped through. The scent of wood smoke hung in the air, mixed with the dustier smell of chalk and old paper, and somewhere outside a crow called, its voice harsh and lonely. Silas Webb made his final adjustments, tilting the camera a fraction of an inch, measuring the light that fell across his subjects' faces. He noted, in the detached way of someone accustomed to working with the dead, that the girl in the third row seemed unusually still, but he attributed this to good behavior or perhaps shyness. Her eyes, when he glanced at them, appeared to be open, though he could not be certain from his position behind the camera. He counted down, his voice muffled and distant, and then the shutter clicked, capturing the image in a fraction of a second, freezing that cold morning in silver and shadow. When the photograph was developed some days later and delivered to the Whitfield home in a simple frame, the family displayed it with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They saw their daughter present among her classmates, looking much as she had in life. And if there was something strange about her expression, something too fixed and too distant, they attributed it to the limitations of photography, to the long exposure times that made everyone look slightly unnatural. The parents displayed the photograph proudly, never seeing what others would one day notice. The photograph remained in the Whitfield home for nearly 20 years, hanging on the wall of the front room where visitors could see it and where the family passed it daily, until eventually it became just another part of the landscape, noticed only when someone new arrived and asked about it. Martha Whitfield would explain, her voice carefully neutral, that it was Clara's class, taken just before she passed, and visitors would nod solemnly and change the subject. After Martha's death in 1906, the house was sold, and the photograph, along with other family possessions, was donated to the County Historical Society by a distant cousin who had no attachment to the objects and no room for them in her own home. It sat in a storage room for decades, boxed with other images of people no one could name, places no one could identify, moments that had lost their context and meaning. But in the spring of 1935, a young man named David Marsh began working as an archivist for the Alabama Department of History, and one of his first assignments was to catalog and preserve the photographs that had accumulated in various county collections. David was 26, a recent graduate with a degree in history and a passionate belief in the importance of preserving the past. He approached his work with meticulous care, examining each photograph, trying to determine its date and origin, creating detailed records that would allow future researchers to understand what they were seeing. When he came to the photograph of Miss Porter's class, he studied it as he had studied hundreds of others, noting the style of clothing, the architecture visible through the windows, the quality of the print. But something about one face in the third row made him pause. The girl's expression was different from the others. while her classmates showed the typical range of emotions captured in such photographs. Awkward smiles or serious stares or the slight blur of movement, this girl appeared absolutely motionless, her features set in a stillness that seemed unnatural. Her eyes, which should have been the most animated part of her face, were oddly flat, reflecting the camera's flash in a way that made them appear almost luminous. David made a note in his ledger and continued his work, but the image stayed with him. Over the following weeks, he began to research the photograph's origins. The Historical Society's records indicated it had come from the Whitfield family, and a date of 1887 was written on the back of the frame. David searched through county records looking for information about the school, about the teacher, about any of the children who might have been photographed that day. What he found was routine at first: tax records and census data, a list of students enrolled at the rural school. But then he discovered something that made him return to the photograph with new eyes. Among the county death records for 1887, he found an entry for Clara Whitfield, aged 12, died September 28th of typhoid fever. The date of death was 8 days before the photograph had been taken, according to the notation on the back of the frame. David checked and rechecked his sources, thinking he had made an error, that perhaps there were two Clara Whitfields, or that the date on the photograph was wrong. But the more he investigated, the more certain he became. He found a brief mention in the local newspaper, a notice of Clara's death and burial. He found the school attendance records, which showed her present until late September and then absent, with no return noted. And he found, in a trunk of old letters donated by a descendant of the Brennan family, a note from Sarah Brennan to her cousin, dated October of 1887, which mentioned attending a class photograph taken after her dear friend Clara had passed away. The deeper he searched, the more the photograph seemed less a memory and more a question. David Marsh spent the next several months consumed by the mystery of the photograph. He wrote letters to descendants of the families whose children appeared in the image, hoping to find someone who remembered stories passed down, some explanation for why a deceased child would be included in a class portrait. Most of his letters went unanswered, but a few responses trickled back, offering fragments of information that only deepened the puzzle. One woman, whose grandmother had been a student in Miss Porter's class, wrote that she remembered being told about the photograph, remembered her grandmother saying that it had been taken as a memorial, a way to keep Clara with her classmates one final time. Another correspondent, a grandson of Thomas Whitfield, confirmed that Clara had died in late September and that the photograph had been taken in early October, and he included a copy of a letter his grandfather had written to a brother describing the event in terms that were both proud and heartbroken. But as David delved deeper into the historical context, he began to encounter explanations that were more troubling than the simple fact of a post-mortem photograph. In the medical literature of the 1880s, he found numerous accounts of catalepsy, a condition in which a person fell into a death-like trance, their breathing and heartbeat slowed to the point of being undetectable by the crude diagnostic methods of the time. There were documented cases of people being declared dead and prepared for burial, only to revive hours or even days later, sometimes in their coffins, sometimes as they were being transported to the cemetery. The fear of premature burial was so widespread in the Victorian era that patents were filed for coffins with bells attached, with air tubes and escape mechanisms, with glass windows set into the lids so that watchmen could check for signs of movement. David found newspaper accounts from Alabama in the same period, stories of people who had been buried alive and whose anguished cries had been heard by passers-by, stories of coffins that had been exhumed and found to contain bodies in positions suggesting a desperate struggle. The more he read, the more he wondered about Clara Whitfield. about the diagnosis that had been made by a rural doctor with limited tools and training, about the 7 days between the onset of her illness and her declared death, about what might have been missed in the rush to prepare her body and lay her to rest. He studied the photograph again with a magnifying glass, examining Clara's face with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her eyes were indeed open, a detail he had noted before, but now he saw other things as well. The position of her hands, which appeared to have been placed rather than naturally folded. The slight tension in her jaw, as though she were clenching her teeth. The way her skin, even in the black and white image, seemed to have a different quality from the skin of the children around her. Not exactly pale, but somehow less present, as though she were fading even as the camera captured her. But there was also another possibility, one that David encountered in his research into early photography techniques. The cameras of the 1880s required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds, during which subjects had to remain absolutely still or risk appearing as blurs or ghostly overlays in the final image. Living subjects, especially children, often struggled with this requirement, and photographs from the era are filled with slightly blurred faces, with eyes that had blinked mid-exposure, with mouths caught partway between expressions. But a deceased subject would naturally remain motionless, would provide the perfect stillness that photographers desired. It was possible, David realized, that Clara's eerily sharp appearance in the photograph was not evidence that she had been alive, but rather proof that she had been dead, her body providing the absolute stillness that her living classmates could not achieve. The scientific explanations were rational, well documented, supported by historical evidence, and yet there was something about them that felt more unsettling than any ghost story. If Clara had been alive when that shutter clicked, then history had mistaken silence for death. As the months turned into years and David Marsh continued his research, the mystery of the photograph evolved from an intellectual puzzle into something more emotionally complex. He began to seek out and read the personal documents of families who had lived through the 1880s in rural Alabama, the diaries and letters and account books that had been preserved in attics and handed down through generations. What emerged from these sources was a portrait of a world in which death was not an aberration, but a constant companion, where families expected to lose children and where the boundary between the living and the dead was frighteningly thin. In one diary, kept by a farmer's wife in a county adjacent to where the Whitfields had lived, David found an entry dated November of 1883 that read, "Buried our Sarah today, though I cannot shake the feeling that we have made a terrible mistake, that she was only sleeping and we have sealed her away from the light forever." In another collection of letters, a mother wrote to her sister about watching over her feverish son, describing how she had held a mirror to his lips every few minutes for 3 days after he stopped breathing, terrified that she would miss some faint sign of life. The fear was pervasive, supported by enough genuine cases of premature burial that it could not be dismissed as mere superstition. David found records of at least 4 instances in Alabama alone during the decade of the 1880s when coffins had been opened due to family members' insistence, revealing bodies that showed signs of having moved after burial, scratches on the inside of coffin lids, fabric clutched in rigid hands. But there was also another theme that emerged from these personal documents, a theme of love and denial, of families who could not bear to let go, who convinced themselves that the death they had witnessed was not real, that their loved ones were merely sleeping and might yet wake. David read accounts of parents who refused to bury children for days, who kept vigil beside bodies that had clearly begun to decay, who searched desperately for any sign of breath or heartbeat long after both had ceased. He read about funeral wakes that lasted a week with the deceased laid out in the parlor, while family members watched and waited, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The photograph of Clara Whitfield began to seem less like an oddity and more like a testament to this desperate hope, this refusal to accept finality. Perhaps Martha Whitfield had insisted on including Clara in the class portrait, not as a memorial, but because some part of her could not yet believe that her daughter was truly gone. Perhaps the decision to pose Clara among her living classmates was an act of defiance against death, a way of saying that Clara still belonged to their world, that she had not yet crossed over completely. David found himself thinking about Miss Porter, the school teacher, who had suggested the photograph in the first place. Had she believed she was offering comfort to a grieving family, or had she harbored her own doubts about Clara's death, her own hope that the diagnosis had been wrong? In a collection of school records, David found a notation in what he believed to be Miss Porter's handwriting, dated 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, which read, "Cannot stop thinking about Clara. Should have sent for the doctor sooner. Should have known." The guilt was palpable even across decades, the sense that something had been missed or misunderstood, that the adults who were supposed to protect these children had failed in some fundamental way. In the photograph, Clara's hand rests just behind another girl's shoulder, a touch so faint it feels both comforting and unreachable. The legacy of the photograph extended far beyond the Whitfield family and the students of that one-room schoolhouse. As David Marsh's research became known, first through a small article in a historical journal, and later through a more widely circulated piece in a regional newspaper, the image began to attract attention from a broader audience. By the 1950s, it had become something of a legend in Alabama, referenced in folklore collections and ghost story anthologies, transformed from a historical document into a symbol of the era's morbid customs and its deep-seated fears about death. College students studying anthropology analyzed it as an example of Victorian mourning rituals, while photography historians examined it for what it revealed about the technical limitations and possibilities of early cameras. Medical historians used it as a teaching tool, discussing the diagnostic challenges faced by 19th century physicians and the tragic consequences of their limited understanding of coma, catalepsy, and other conditions that could mimic death. Paranormal researchers inevitably claimed the photograph as evidence of spirits and hauntings, pointing to Clara's expression as proof of something supernatural, though their interpretations were generally dismissed by serious scholars. What no one could dismiss, however, was the photograph's emotional power. Whenever it was displayed in exhibitions about Alabama history or Victorian culture, visitors would linger before it, drawn by something they could not quite name. Some reported feeling a sense of profound sadness, others a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Parents would pull their children a little closer, grateful for the medical advances that separated their world from the world of Clara Whitfield, where a fever could kill in days and where the tools for determining death were so imprecise that terrible mistakes could be made. In the 1970s, a photographic analyst named Elizabeth Keating conducted a detailed technical study of the image, using methods that had not been available to David Marsh decades earlier. She examined the original plate, which had been preserved in the state archives, and she published a paper analyzing the exposure, the lighting, the subtle details of each subject's appearance. Her conclusion was measured and careful. Based on the quality of Clara's image, the absolute stillness and clarity of her features, compared to the slight blurriness visible in some of her classmates, Keating concluded that Clara had indeed been deceased at the time the photograph was taken. The post-mortem hypothesis was, in her professional opinion, the most likely explanation. But she also noted in a brief aside that suggested she too had felt the photograph's haunting power, that certainty was impossible, that the past kept its secrets and that some questions could never be definitively answered. A medical historian named Dr. Raymond Teller, writing in the 1980s, examined the death records and the description of Clara's illness and concluded that she had most likely died of typhoid fever, a disease that was common in the era and often fatal, especially in children. He noted that typhoid was well understood by doctors of the time and that misdiagnosis was unlikely, though he acknowledged that in rare cases, patients could fall into comas that were mistaken for death. His work was thorough and convincing, and yet it too could not fully dispel the sense of uncertainty that clung to the story. The photograph had become more than a historical curiosity. It had become a reminder of how fragile life was in the years before modern medicine, how close to tragedy every family lived, how thin the line between the living and the dead could be. It had become a meditation on grief and memory, on the ways that people tried to hold on to those they loved, on the power of images to preserve moments that should have been lost to time. And it had become a question that could never be fully answered, a mystery that resisted all attempts at complete resolution. Was Clara Whitfield dead when the photograph was taken, her body posed among her classmates in a ritual that seems strange to modern sensibilities but was not uncommon in her time? Or was she alive, trapped in some cataleptic state that her family and her doctor had mistaken for death, her open eyes staring out from the photograph as a silent accusation, a testimony to a mistake that could never be undone? The photograph remains, a silent classroom where one child's gaze reminds us that the past is never as still as it seems, and that some truths, no matter how desperately we search for them, remain forever suspended between certainty and doubt, between history and myth, between the known and the unknowable, a moment frozen in time that refuses to yield its secrets, even as it compels us to keep looking, keep wondering, keep trying to understand what really happened on that cold October morning in 1887, when 23 children and one photographer gathered in a rural schoolhouse and created an image that would outlive them all, an image that would carry forward through the generations, not just as a record of faces and names, but as a haunting reminder of our own mortality, our own fears, and our own desperate need to hold on to those we love, even when they have passed beyond our reach into that country from which no traveler returns.